أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Now we're going to discuss the issue of evolution, and we're going to discuss it in a limited way, in a general way, to answer some general questions about it. We're not going to be talking about very detailed mechanisms of how evolution happens, but just how it relates to Islam in the general sense, and how rational and reasonable the method of evolution actually is. So should we believe in it? Should we not believe in it? And it's important to talk about evolution because unlike many other scientific theories out there, evolution is actually used when putting forth moral principles and when creating an ideology for life. And there are a lot of people that when they propose how our society, how our morals and our lifestyle should be, they use evolution as a foundation. They use evolution for evidence in order to establish their ideas. So when we're talking about truth, anything that we accept as truth must conform to the primary truths established by reasoning. We spoke yesterday about self-evident truths, about reasoning, and how these self-evident truths in our reasoning, they lead to belief in God. We understand that God exists. We understand that there's only one God. We understand that God is just. We understand that through God's justice, He sends infallible prophets with His message for mankind, and also that He appoints there's divinely appointed leaders by God that guide mankind. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the final prophet. The Quran is the final revelation. It is God's infallible words, and whatever contradicts the Quran or the words of the Prophet or the words of the Ahlul Bayt that have been established as their words, these things are false. So if we can't reconcile it with the Quran, if we can't reconcile it with the accepted words of the Prophet and Ahlul Bayt, then we cannot accept these things as true. And there are several ways to judge the truth value of evolution. The first is, does evolution contradict the Quran? The second is evolution consistent with itself? The third would be, has evolution, in the manner that we are talking about, the grand scale of evolution, macroevolution of one species changing into another, has it ever been witnessed? So we're going to basically look at these three things. As far as the third one, the definition of evolution is that change of one species into another species happens over millions of years. So the time frame for this is so big that it is impossible to observe this. So therefore, it's not something that we can empirically observe and test. So no macroevolution where one species over time changes into another species. This has never been witnessed. So we're going to look at the definition of evolution in summary, through the words of one of the world's most famous evolutionary zoologists, biologists, and one of the world's greatest and most popular celebrity atheists, and that is Mr. Richard Dawkins. So Mr. Richard Dawkins had given an interview to The New Scientist, and in that interview he has said the following. He says, "The world is divided into things that look designed, like birds and airliners, and things that don't, rocks and mountains. Things that look designed are divided into those that really are designed, submarines and tin openers, and those that are not, sharks and hedgehogs. The diagnostic of things that look or are designed is that their parts are assembled in ways that are statistically improbable in a functional direction. They do something well, for instance, fly." So this is a quote from Richard Dawkins. Now he incorrectly assumes that only moving or living things look designed. So the moving thing would be like a submarine or a can opener, a living thing like the bird and the shark and the hedgehog. However, the things that he says do not move or they don't look designed, like he mentioned rocks. The rocks and the mountains and all those things that do not move, they follow the same natural laws that are followed by the moving and living things that are followed by the bird and the submarine. So they're made of the same fixed materials, they follow the same fixed rules, they obey the same natural commands, they follow the same standards. So the composition of the rocks and their adherence to natural laws are as much a design as the submarine and the birds. Next, he says, continues, Darwinian natural selection can produce an uncanny illusion of design. An engineer would be hard put to decide whether a bird or a plane was the more aerodynamically elegant. So powerful is the illusion of design, it took humanity until the mid-19th century to realize that it is an illusion. In 1859, Charles Darwin announced one of the greatest ideas ever to occur to a human mind, cumulative evolution by natural selection. Living complexity is indeed orders of magnitude too improbable to have come about by chance, but only if we assume that all the luck has to come in one fell swoop. When cascades of small chance steps accumulate, you can reach prodigious heights of adaptive complexity. That cumulative buildup is evolution. Its guiding force is natural selection. So Mr. Richard Dawkins here, he asserts and he claims that nature, such as a bird, is not designed, while a plane produced by an engineer, a submarine, is designed. But now we have to ask the question, did the engineer who made that plane, did the engineer create the rules of flight? Did he create the rules of air currents and gravity? Or did he learn those rules and apply them to a vessel that they call a plane? What did the engineer do? He saw how the birds fly, and so he copied it. So the engineer copied the bird. So how can the copy be called a design while the original is not a design? It doesn't make rational sense. Scientists do not write laws of nature. They do not create these concepts. What they do is that they learn these things from nature and they copy nature. He continues, every living creature has ancestors, but only a fraction have descendants. And this is going to be a long quote, but it's important to read these things thoroughly so that we don't misrepresent what the evolutionists are saying, and so we get a proper understanding to be able to properly analyze it. So he says in this long quote, every living creature has ancestors, but only a fraction have descendants. All inherit the genes of an unbroken sequence of successful ancestors, none of whom died young, and none of whom failed to reproduce. Genes that program embryos to develop into adults who can successfully reproduce automatically survive in the gene pool at the expense of genes that fail. This is natural selection at the gene level, and we notice its consequences at the organism level. There has to be an ultimate source of new genetic variation, and it is mutation. Copies of newly mutated genes are reshuffled through the gene pool by sexual reproduction, and selection removes them from the pool in a way that is non-random. What makes for success in the business of life varies from species to species. Some swim, some walk, some fly, some climb, some root themselves into the soil and tilt green solar panels towards the sun. All this diversity stems from successive branchings, starting from a single bacterium-like ancestor which lived between 3 and 4 billion years ago. Each branching event is called a speciation. A breeding population splits into two, and they go their separately evolving ways. Among sexually reproducing species, speciation is said to have occurred when the two gene pools have separated so far that they can no longer interbreed. Speciation begins by accident when separation has reached the stage where there is no interbreeding even without a geographical barrier. We have the origin of a new species. Natural selection is quintessentially non-random, yet it is lamentably often called random. This one mistake underlies much of the skeptical backlash against evolution. Chance cannot explain life. Design is as bad an explanation as chance because it raises bigger questions than it answers. Evolution by natural selection is the only workable theory ever proposed that is capable of explaining life, and it does so brilliantly. End quote from Mr. Richard Dawkins. So, according to evolutionary theory, mutation introduces a change into the gene pool. Natural selection determines if that change is passed on to the next generation. And lots of changes over a long period of time result in a species turning into a different species. So the change over time from one species into another species is called evolution. So therefore, natural selection and mutation are the main factors in the process of evolution. So as for the creation of the human being, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Holy Quran, Surah An-Nisa, chapter 4, verse number 1, Ya ayyuhan nas, O mankind, ittaqu rabbakum, fear your Lord, alladhi khalaqakum min nafsi wahidah, who created you from a single being, wa khalaqa minha zawjaha, and created its mate from the same, وَبَثَّ مِنْهُمَا رِجَالًا كَثِيرًا وَنِسَاءً, and spread from these two many men and women. And also in chapter 6 verse 98, Allah says, وَهُوَ الَّذِي أَنْشَأَكُم مِّن نَفْسٍ وَاحِدَةٍ, and He it is who has brought you into being from a single soul. And also Allah says, Surah 15 verses 26 to 28, وَلَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ مِنْ صَلْصَالٍ مِّنْ حَمَإٍ مَسْنُونٍ, and certainly we created man of clay, of mud fashioned in shape. وَالْجَانَّ خَلَقْنَاهُ مِنْ قَبْلُ مِنْ نَارِ السَّمُومِ, and the jinn we created before of intensely hot fire. وَإِذْ قَالَ رَبُّكَ لِلْمَلَائِكَةِ, and when your Lord said to the angels, إِنِّي خَالِقٌ بَشَرًا مِّنْ صَلْصَالٍ مِّنْ حَمَإٍ مَسْنُونٍ, verily I am going to create a human being from mud fashioned in shape. So God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, created human beings directly from the earth. And the creation of Adam alayhi salam is used as an example to prove another point in the Quran. We all know the story of the event of Mubahila, when a group of Christians came to the Prophet to determine if he truly was the final prophet, and they presented their belief of Jesus as being the Son of God. And then Allah revealed this verse of Quran to answer their false belief. إِنَّ مَثَلَ عِيسَى عِنْدَ اللَّهِ كَمَثَلِ آدَمَ, verily the likeness, the example of Jesus with Allah is like the example of Adam. خَلَقَهُ مِنْ تُرَابٍ, He created him from dust. ثُمَّ قَالَ لَهُ كُنْ فَيَكُونَ, and then said to him, be, and he was. So the Christians were saying that Jesus did not have a father, so his father had to be God. So Allah reveals this verse to show that Adam alayhi salam was created directly from the dust, having no father or mother. But he is not a son of God, just like Jesus is not a son of God. So we know from the Quran and from narrations that Adam alayhi salam did not have parents. If evolution were true, in the way that has been described so far and is known as evolution, then Adam and Eve, peace be upon them, would have been two humans out of many humans in a species. There would already have been a species of humans existing from which Adam and Eve would have descended. They would have had human parents and human ancestors, maybe human uncles and aunts and brothers and cousins and siblings, nieces, nephews, big old family, and they would have been living on earth their whole lives, not in the garden first and then sent down to the earth. So the story of Adam alayhi salam and Hawa salamullah alayha, Adam and Eve, according to Islam, is diametrically opposed to the concept of how human beings came to be on this earth through evolution. So the ways that evolution is said to have occurred. So that is just a very brief comparison of how human beings came to be according to Islam and how evolution says, and we see that they cannot be reconciled with each other. Next, the mechanism by which evolution is said to happen. Is it rational? Is it reasonable? Is natural selection fueled by mutation? So natural selection is defined as the process in nature by which, according to Darwin's theory of evolution, that only the organisms who are best adapted to their environment tend to survive and transmit their genetic characters in increasing numbers to succeeding generations, while those that are less adapted tend to be eliminated because they don't pass on their genes, they don't reproduce, they don't have offspring, so their genes do not get passed on. Natural selection can actually be observed in the natural world, but it does not cause a population to change into a new species. Why? This is because evolution requires and needs new variation to happen. It needs new traits and new genes to be introduced into the gene pool, but natural selection can only select from the traits that already exist. So natural selection would either reduce variation or maintain the variation that's already there. It doesn't increase it because it only chooses from the genes that are existing. So evolutionists say that variation enters a population in other ways. The first and the most prolific way that genes are supposed to enter into a gene pool, new genes, is mutation. A mutation is defined as a change of the DNA sequence within a gene or chromosome of an organism, resulting in the creation of a new character or trait not found in the parental type. So parents have offsprings, and somehow, through some process, the genes of the offspring change, and new genes are introduced into the children that were not there in the parents. So this is how they say the new variation comes about. And in order for a mutation to actually be passed on, it must not work against the organism's ability to reproduce. So it has to help it reproduce, or at least it can't go against it reproducing. So we could look at DNA of an organism like a book, because DNA basically is instructions for how the organism is supposed to develop, how the organs and all the systems in the organism operate, and also how it reproduces. So it's basically like a manual for the organism. So if we think of a very, very big book manual as the DNA, and we can consider mutations as changing letters within the words of that manual, changing random words, because this is what mutation is. It's supposed to be random changes or additions into the DNA of the organism. So if we have a textbook that has hundreds of pages, each one of those pages having hundreds of words, and those words being made of multiple letters. So now let's say that every time one of these books is copied at the printer, we open a random page, pick a random word, and you change it into a random letter. This is what mutation is doing in the natural world. Will the changed word stay the same? If the word still has meaning, does it make the book a better book? Or does it change the meaning of the sentence that it's in? If it changes the meaning of the sentence, will that not also change the meaning of everything else in that chapter? You change the meaning of the chapter, will that change the meaning in the whole book? Now, there's also editors looking at these books. As we know, those of you who are a little more educated in the sciences know that when the DNA is being replicated, that there are mechanisms by which that sequence is checked for errors. It doesn't always catch all the errors, but it does a pretty good job. So in the same way, when the editor looks at the book and catches this mistake, is he going to correct it, or is he going to leave it in there? So will more random changes every time that we print this book, is it going to produce a better book? Eventually, let's say there's lots of changes. Will it become a better book? Or will it turn into a different book? Will it become from fiction to nonfiction? Will it turn from a romance into an adventure book? And will the book turn eventually into a computer, or will it turn into a shoe? I mean, from one species to another, from a tree to something else, from a bacteria to a whale, this is very, very different. So will the book change into something completely different? So you can do this on a very small scale. Write a sentence and just randomly change letters in the words and see how long it takes until you find something better. So even when scientists have artificially mutated genes in the laboratory, and a lot of these experiments have been done on fruit flies. There have been so many mutations done to these poor flies that none of them have ever led to a single beneficial mutation. These poor things are mutated, they're deformed, they do not turn into super strong or super intelligent. They don't become superheroes, and the same thing is not going to happen to us either. So mutation has never been shown in the laboratory or through observation to have been beneficial, even when it was artificially produced. So we cannot say that mutation is actually a beneficial or a proper or a rational, or we could say in the way that evolutionists say that mutation works, it has not been shown to work. Next is, they say that reproduction is the way that new genes are introduced. Reproduction is described as a natural formation and offspring of genetic combinations not present in parents. So you have two parents with different traits, different DNA. when they reproduce together, their genes cross over, and you can have different combinations of their genes. But reproduction can only make combinations from the genes that are already present. It doesn't make new genetic material. So it cannot be a source for variation needed for evolution, just like mutation cannot. Another way that genes are supposed to be introduced into the gene pool is what's called gene flow, which is defined as the alteration of the frequencies of alleles of particular genes in a population resulting from interbreeding with organisms from another population having different frequencies. So what gene flow does is it brings existing genes from one population into another population that didn't have them before. This is like when you have two different ethnicities, so gene flow in some cultures is not allowed, where you see from one ethnicity the genes flow over to another. You might have somebody from Pakistan marrying somebody from Afghanistan, which sometimes isn't looked down upon. So this is gene flow. Children have parents from two or more different ethnic backgrounds, but gene flow does not make new genetic material. So it cannot be a source for variation. It's new to that ethnicity, but overall it's not new. So gene flow only chooses or selects from what's already there. And it tends to make populations genetically similar. So if you have one ethnicity, let's say you have a darker complexion, another one has a lighter complexion, when they interbreed over generations, they're going to all start to look the same. So the more gene flow occurs, the more similar the populations will become. So over time, the more human beings have interactions with each other, it's very possible that we're all going to start looking the same. And then there's what is called genetic drift. And this is random changes in the frequency of alleles in the gene pool. And this usually happens within small populations. So genetic drift is when a trait is passed from their parent to the child, and there's more than one allele for that gene. So usually there's two alleles for each gene. So genetic drift refers to the rate at which one of those is passed over the other. So genetic drift does not, once again, just like natural selection, just like reproduction, just like genetic flow, genetic drift does not create new genetic material, but it only selects from what's already there. So it cannot be a source for variation, which is needed for evolution. And scientists themselves, evolutionary scientists themselves, have said that in the longer term, the main result of genetic drift is the loss of genetic variation. Because they say randomly or by chance, one of them is completely selected out of the two, and that remains. So they say given enough time, this will always be the effect of genetic drift, that by chance alleles will be lost. And the smaller the population, since genetic drift has a stronger effect on small populations, the more quickly genetic variation will be lost. So what do we realize from this summary? Number one, that mutation does not produce beneficial results. It actually produces harm, and it can be a killer. Reproduction only works with existing genes. Genetic drift reduces variation within a population. Even if genetic flow brings more variation from another population, genetic drift will work again to reduce that variation. So genetic drift and genetic flow and natural selection work together to make everyone in the world the same. So all of the forces that are supposed to work for evolution to create new species, they are in fact by definition working against it. So when we're talking about evolution, just on the rational side, it cannot be reconciled with Islam, and by its own mechanisms, by its own definition, it cannot work the way that it's supposed to work. And if we look at evolution in terms of relying on authority, because a lot of times these discussions about evolution end up with the scientists saying, well, you don't know what you're talking about. We're scientists, we've studied this for many years, all these different branches of science agree on evolution. They say this, but it's not always true. If we're relying on authority, let's consider it this way. Consider how those who push evolution the most are the ones who reject God the most. So if we're relying on authority, what does it say about the capability of judging, their ability to judge? What does it say about an authority that rejects the most obvious truth? If they can't see that God exists, if they reject God, then why should we accept their judgment in other philosophical areas. So now there's another topic that arises out of the discussion of evolution, and it's a major discussion between people who believe in God and atheists who do not believe in God, and that is the equality of all human beings. Religion teaches that we have a soul, we have a spirit, that we're not just this body, that we have an undying soul, that when the body dies, the soul still remains alive. This is what religion teaches. Atheism and materialism says that there is no soul. Therefore, if this were to be true, if there's no soul, and if we're just physical bodies, how do we judge a person's value except by their physical attributes? If there's no infinitely valuable soul, if there's no soul whose value cannot be judged by human standards, then how do we judge a person's value? By their hair color, by their eye color, by their skin color, their height, their weight, their speed, their agility, their IQ, how they measure on certain tests, what type of job they have, how much education have they had, what type of resume they have. And then there's qualities that don't have a numerical range. Like we can't measure these things, but we can view them as good or bad. So do we judge people according to their race, their ethnicity, nationality, which family they come from, which political party they're a part of? Do we judge them good or bad according to these? So if we judge people by physical attributes, we have to choose one of these. We can't just say that all people are equal. Then when we ask, well, how are they equal? If there's no soul, how are two people equal? If people are just matter and physical, and we judge them by their physical attributes, no two people are physically the same. How many people are exactly the same height? How many people are exactly the same weight? How many people are made up of exactly the same number of atoms? So without the soul, human equality is impossible because there is no standard by which it is possible for them to be equal. So religion teaches that the soul is what gives us our human value. Allah, again, in that same verse that we mentioned, chapter 4, Surah An-Nisa, Surah number 4, verse 1, Allah says, "Fear your Lord who created you from a single soul and then multiplied you from that." Or in the famous verse in Surah Al-Hujurat, chapter 49, verse number 13, "O mankind, verily we have created you from one male and one female and made you tribes and families that you may know each other. The most honorable of you with God is the most pious among you." So a person's value, there's two very important points to notice here. Number one is that our value is judged by our morality and our virtue. And that value and that morality, that virtue is not judged by each other, but is judged by God. So we don't judge each other's moral value, only God judges that moral value. So the only thing we can do is to pretend and assume that everybody is of infinite value. So we're not allowed to take anybody's life. We're not allowed to value one race or one people over another. So we have examples of prominent atheists who admit that morality and human equality would not exist without religion. Because it's only a matter of time before the logical conclusion of not believing in God and not believing in the soul is going to come out. So we're going to go through some examples of famous prominent evolutionists and atheists who are actually going to say what we're saying because this is what it logically leads to. So William Provine, a professor at Cornell University, an eminent atheist philosopher, says, quote, "Naturalistic evolution has clear consequences that Charles Darwin understood perfectly." And he lists 5 things here. Number 1, he says, no gods worth having exist. Number 2, no life after death exists. Number 3, no ultimate foundation for ethics exists. No standard, meaning anything goes. Number 4, no ultimate meaning in life exists. And number 5, human free will is non-existent. And he says, the first 4 implications are so obvious to modern naturalistic evolutionists that I will spend little time defending them, meaning in his circle of all those people who believe in evolution and atheists, they all admit this to one another, even if most of them don't say this openly in public. But he has the bravery and the courage to say this. Next, we have a quote from Charles Darwin from The Descent of Man, where he says, "At some future period not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. At the same time, the anthropomorphous apes, as Professor Schaffhausen has remarked, will no doubt be exterminated. The break between man and his nearest allies will then be wider, for it will intervene between man and a more civilized state, as we may hope, even than the Caucasian and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of as now between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla, end quote. James Rachels, philosopher who specialized in ethics and animal rights. He writes, an infant with severe brain damage, even if it survives for many years, may never learn to speak, and its mental powers may never rise above a primitive level. In fact, its psychological capacities may be markedly inferior to those of a typical rhesus monkey. In that case, moral individualism, who sees no reason, says that there's no reason to prefer its life over the monkey's. Some unfortunate humans, perhaps because they have suffered brain damage, are not rational agents. What are we to say about them? The natural conclusion, according to the doctrine we are considering, would be that their status is that of mere animals, and perhaps we should go on to conclude that they may be used as non-human animals are used, perhaps as laboratory subjects or as food, end quote. So these guys are just saying what is the logical conclusion of having a morality that is based on materialism. Without God, without religion, they admit there is no standard, there is no objective standard by which everyone is supposed to conform to, but everybody can make up their own morality, and that morality is going to be based on materialism, based on a person's physical characteristics. And since there is no objective morality, no standard, things that are disgusting to people, things that are completely abhorrent, may eventually become allowable. So there's another example. There's the famous physicist Charles Kraus. He was in a lot of trouble a few years ago because he made a comment in which somebody asked him about incest, sexual relations between brothers and sisters, and he was forced to say that there really is no objective reason why something like that would not be allowed. You see, without God and without religion, they don't have any reason why something like that would be morally objectionable. They say that if the two are consenting to the relationship and there's no offspring, well, then there's nothing wrong with it. According to materialism, according to atheism and evolution, why would something like that be wrong if there's consent and if there's no offspring? So it's only religion that shows us why these things are wrong. It's only belief in God and belief in an objective morality that keeps us away from these types of abhorrent actions. Peter Singer, another philosopher, has said, we can no longer base our ethics on the idea that human beings are a special form of creation. Our better understanding of our own nature has bridged the gulf that was once thought to lie between ourselves and other species. So why should we believe that the mere fact that why should we believe that the mere fact that a being is a member of the species Homo sapiens endows its life with some unique, almost infinite value? If we compare a severely defective human infant with a non-human animal, a dog or a pig, for example, we will often find the non-human to have superior capacities, both actual and potential, for rationality, self-consciousness, communication, and anything else that can plausibly be considered morally significant. Now remember, when he says morally significant, it's restricted to the material, nothing spiritual. He continues, only the fact that the defective infant is a member of the species Homo sapiens leads it to be treated differently from the dog or pig. Species membership alone, however, is not morally relevant. If we can put aside the obsolete and erroneous notion of the sanctity of all human life, we may start to look at human life as it really is, at the quality of life that each human being has or can achieve. He continues, when the death of a disabled infant will lead to the birth of another infant with better prospects of a happy life, the total amount of happiness will be greater if the disabled infant is killed. The loss of the happy life for the first infant is outweighed by the gain of a happier life for the second. Therefore, if killing the hemophiliac infant has no adverse effect on others, it would, according to the total view, be right to kill him. End quote. No objective morality, no God, no religion. This is the result. These atheists are simply, what are they doing? They're taking atheism and materialism to its logical conclusion. Our beliefs produce our actions. This is a basic principle. So if we believe that there is no soul, then we will determine and judge and measure each person's value by their physical characteristics. People are equal. Religion says that people are equal because of their humanity, not their race, their gender, their height, or other measurable qualities, or what supposed type of happiness they can bring to other people. Every life is sacred. And this is only possible with belief in God, because every person has a sacred, non-physical soul that gives that person life. And its worth cannot be measured by instruments, and it is prioritized over anything material. If a person, God forbid, loses a limb, like a person loses an arm, loses a leg, we don't say that that person is less human, because what makes that person a human is their soul. So it doesn't matter what their physical capacities are. If that person is brain damaged, they do not become less human, because it is that soul that makes that person a human being and gives it infinite value. Atheism, materialism, is incompatible with human equality. A human being composed of only matter cannot have a constant human value, because our physical characteristics are always changing. So how can my value always be the same? Atheists might argue that equality is established by virtue of being born into the same species, but this categorizes a person as a human. So let's say the atheist says, yeah, well, even if they agree that human beings have more value than other animals, it still doesn't explain why humans between themselves must be considered equal, or that they should be treated equally. Okay, we're a different species than dog or a pig or apes, and let's say we're better than them, but why should we be treated equally between ourselves? Atheism cannot answer this and cannot provide for this. Matter can be measured. So if we human beings are just matter, then our material humanity could be measured, categorized, and it could be ranked. So in that case, equality would only be possible between people who, atom for atom, are exactly the same. That's the only way we can say that people are the same, if physically they're exactly the same. They would have to be replicas of one another, and there are no two people in the history of the world who are like this. So when atheists support human equality, we applaud them, we admire this, but we know that that support for that human equality contradicts their atheism, which can only proclaim equality after borrowing it from religion. Equality of human beings makes sense with God and religion, but it does not make sense with atheism and materialism. So we're going to take a little break, and we'll come back, inshallah, and we will discuss the issue of morality, what we mean by this, and how it is affected by both theism and atheism. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.